Good morning and welcome everyone from Washington, D.C., whether you are joining us here virtually or tuning in from around the world. It's my pleasure today to open this conversation on unlocking Africa's single market, AfCFTA's impact on business and investment. This is a moment of great promise and great responsibility as we convene to explore how we can translate regional integration into inclusive economic growth. This event is organized in partnership with our dear friends of the Policy Center for the New South, the largest think tank in Africa from Morocco under Karim El Ainawi's leadership, as well as Citigroup. I would like to thank for their great support. We gather in the wake of the 39th ordinary session of the African Union Executive Council and Assembly in Addis Ababa, where African trade has occupied agendas and minds. The AfCFTA is more than an agreement on paper. It is an ambitious vision to bring together 1.3 billion consumers across 54 countries, creating the world's largest single market by population and unlocking the potential for business and trade. Thanks to this historic shift, Africans will finally have the opportunity to trade with each other. The level of intra-trade is only 15% compared with 95% between European economies. And 2026 is also historic as African growth is expected to surpass that of Asia for the first time. This is happening in a very special context with US extending African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, for 1 year, and China agreeing zero tariff access for 53 African nations. Over the next hour, we will examine how AfCFTA can shape business landscapes, responsible investment, and deeper cooperation, particularly in a global environment marked by shifting trade dynamics and economic headwinds. I want to acknowledge the distinguished speakers who will share their insights today in alphabetic order. Tobias Alondo, Chief Executive of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, who brings a frontline view from Africa's vibrant manufacturing sector. Farid Belhaj, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, whose expertise bridges policy and investment strategies in global economic engagement. Dr. Olivier Kamanzi, co-founder and chairman of the Africa Global Chamber of Commerce, representing enterprise-driven perspectives on continental market access. Franny Leoutier, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, who authored a remarkable report on behalf of the Atlantic Council on AGOA. Dauda Semben, President and CEO of AfCFTA's, who brings insights on innovation and investment from an African entrepreneurial leader after a long career to support Africa's interest at the IMF. This discussion will be moderated by our dear friend Dana Banks, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, who leads the Africa Center Trade and Investment Initiative. But before going there, it's my true privilege to welcome His Excellency Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA Secretariat, who is joining me for a 15-minute opening discussion. Mr. Mene, welcome. We are going to lay out the new reality of the FTA. Since it has been launched in 2021, and a lot happened with major shifts in the global trade system. You attended this year the African Union. We just attended the African Union Summit. And at this summit, leaders reaffirmed continental priorities on peace, security, water, and Agenda 2063, and called for accelerated implementation of integration projects, including the Africa Free Trade Area. In your view, what concrete decisions or signals from the summit have been laid out? What was the momentum from your perspective and in the space of trade?
Thank you very much, Excellency Ambassador, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion today. First, the summit took note of the fact that we now have 50 countries on the continent that have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA, the most recent being Somalia. So that is a very, very clear indication of political will and, of course, legal commitment to liberalize barriers to intra-Africa trade. That is what ratification is about. It is a legal commitment to eliminate barriers as set out in the agreement. Second, the heads of states recognized that we must move much faster in the integration implementation of the AfCFTA. We know that some regions, some countries are moving much faster than others, but they reached a conclusion that we must have a new vigor in the implementation of the AfCFTA, and I was particularly directed by them, the heads of states, to make sure that this acceleration happens. However, I should note that this is not a criticism to ministers of trade who negotiated the agreement, because the agreement was negotiated in 2017. At least the parts of the agreement that relate to investment, trade, liberalization, they were negotiated when the world was a very different place. Now that we're in a different context, we have to review those tariff reduction formulas in relation to where the world is today. And I think that that is a wise decision by the heads of states to say, let's look at where things stand in the world today. Is what we agreed to in terms of formulas for reducing and elimination of barriers, is it still relevant today? And so we have...
Yeah, maybe if you allow me, precisely, can you give us a preview of this assessments from your perspective? What are the most significant strengths AfCFTA can build on today, and the biggest practical challenges that still need to be overcome?
Well, let me start with the challenges, which actually continue to constrain intra-Africa trade. The cost of transport and logistics continues to be high. The cost of infrastructure, which African Development Bank estimates to be at between $130 to $150 billion annually, the continued lack of fully integrated customs systems. These are some of the barriers that continue to constrain intra-Africa trade. However, we do see some progress. For example, in the year 2024, according to AfCFTA's Intra-Africa Trade Report, Africa recorded $220 billion worth of trade, which was a 12.5% increase from 2023. We see some progress. However, we're not seeing the rapid increase in intra-Africa trade volumes in trade in goods and trade in services that we would like to see because of externalities. By externalities, I'm pointing to infrastructure, transport, and logistics. Moving goods intra-Africa is significantly more expensive, more time-consuming, more cumbersome than moving goods out of Africa to a third country. And so we've got to focus on these externalities that are, quite frankly, beyond the trade agreement. The trade agreement has addressed the barriers that existed for over 70 years. So now we've got to focus on these challenges.
Yeah, and speaking of the cost of transportation, we have all experienced the difficulty to travel from Niamey to Dakar. We have to go back to Paris to be able to reach the Senegalese capital, and that's what, for example, CEOs of companies and investors are complaining about. And I would like to ask you about the private sector role in this vast ambition. Many companies are waiting for perfect implementation before they commit capital, precisely because of these lacks and bottlenecks. How critical, what is your message to CEOs and investors who are hesitant, and how critical is private sector investment in value addition and regional production to the success of the FTA?
The private sector is absolutely key. The ministers of trade did what they were supposed to do. They negotiated an agreement, which is, by the way, a forward-looking trade agreement that includes liberalization of digital trade, establishment of industrial development infrastructure, and also addresses questions of inclusion through the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade. It's a forward-looking trade agreement. It is not going to be implemented by governments. It has to be implemented by the private sector. The private sector has to take a central role in its implementation and take advantage of a greater market that has been opened. We have a very, very clear private sector strategy, which includes in its implementation the smallest and the biggest corporations in Africa. The private sector is absolutely key. We have identified priority sectors: agriculture, transport and logistics, pharmaceuticals, as well as automotive sectors, as some of the sectors that will continue to drive economic growth and development and industrial development on our continent. Every country in Africa has a potential, in our view, from a private sector point of view, to contribute to increased economic development and economic activity in Africa through trade. It's one of the tools through which we can to say private sector is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and particularly maybe in the tech sector, I have to ask you a question before moving to U.S. trade policy. I have to ask you a question, Secretary Mene, about about technology and the digital area we are living, and it is included in the AfCFTA in your AfCFTA work, right? So in this area of digital markets, how will you include these new realities to the digital tools, for example, into the AfCFTA market?
One of the reasons I said in the earlier segment that this is a forward-looking trade agreement is because it is the only trade agreement in the world as we speak today that has far-reaching and comprehensive obligations on the digital economy. We have a protocol on digital trade, which includes long-standing resolution of challenges such as movement of data. Now, since the protocol was adopted, you can move data across the continent. There are no restrictions. It includes establishment of an interoperable continental payment system. It includes provisions that relate to emerging technologies, AI, data protection, as well as, more importantly, from our point of view, inclusion. It establishes an obligation on governments to have programs for SME digital literacy, which we have begun to do with some US companies. So it's a far-reaching instrument that recognizes that the projection by the IFC of Africa's digital economy by the year 2035, reaching $712 billion, my apologies, $712 billion digital economy by the year 2035, according to the IFC. We won't reach that target if we do not liberalize Africa's digital economy. So the rules that we have agreed to are intended to unlock Africa's digital economy, to enable us to reach that target of $712 billion by the year 2035.
Yeah. I have to ask you about Liberation Day. Recent shifts in U.S. trade policy, from the overhaul of AGOA benefits to steep reciprocal tariffs announced that day, have sparked a recalibration of in African trade relations. How do you assess the potential impact of these U.S. policy changes on African exporters? And what role can the FTA play in helping states navigate or mitigate these external shocks? And I would add, do you see the recent China's tariff exemptions on African countries as an asset over the United States?
Well, let me start with the latter part of your question. The trade relations that our continent has are diverse, complicated, and for the most part, they are predicated on our shared vision of the world. And so we have a very strong partnership with China from a point of view of trade and investment relations. That partnership is implemented through FOCAC. So it is not just a trade and investment relationship. It is a relationship based on shared values and shared principles of the world. In respect of the United States, the impact has been materially adverse, of course. In the short term, it has been materially adverse. Lesotho, Angola, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Madagascar. These are countries that have been severely affected by the tariffs and the reconfiguration of AGOA. Let me just say, the US will do what the US has to do for itself. Every country must do what it has to do for itself. I don't fault the US for doing what they think is in their best interest. That's their decision. What we have to do as Africans is to do what is in our best interests. And what is in our best interest is to develop a domestic market of 50 countries, to eradicate the fragmentation that has existed for the last 70 years, to build a viable market that will enable us as Africans to rely on ourselves from the point of view of supply chains in the areas, in the private sector, sectors that I mentioned, and to enable us to have the economic self-sufficiency that is required. So the US will do what it has to do for itself, and that's fine. But what is very clear in this current context is that we now are compelled to build a domestic market so that we rely less on others, more on ourselves. And I believe that we have the capability to do that through the AfCFTA. So this moment that we have been in over the last year and 2 months has been a very seminal moment, and it is a moment that has compelled us to be clear-eyed about what we have to do as Africans.
Secretary Mene, I'm really grateful. I'm sad because we have to interrupt this conversation to move to the panel conversation. It's already 9:50 a.m. here in Washington D.C. and you have a tough mission. You have an exciting and promising mission, a lot to carry on your shoulders. We could have talked about the free movement of people, the currency dynamics. A lot is happening under your leadership. So thank you very much for your exclusive insights to our audience and our Atlantic Council community. One last word, maybe.
Well, let me just thank you very much for the opportunity. We are, as Africans, determined and resolute to make sure that we implement this agreement. As I mentioned, there are 50 state parties that have now committed legally to its implementation. There will be challenges, of course. We all know that. There will be challenges that relate to political instability, macroeconomic imbalances that cause countries to renege on a short-term basis. But the political will is there, the political commitment is there, and we will overcome all of these challenges. I'm very confident of that. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay with you because I have a flight to catch in about 45 minutes. So thank you very, very much.
And have safe travel. Thank you, Secretary Mene.
Thank you.
Dana, over to you. Dana Banks, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, who honored us with her affiliation with us and who leads our effort on trade and investment. Over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Yad. That was really, I think, a great introduction. So informative for us to hear, particularly on the heels of the AU Summit, to hear Secretary General Mene's thoughts and perspectives on where things stand now with implementation and the future. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I think the future is bright. So we will delve into this further with our distinguished panel. Again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you again for joining us for this critical conversation on unlocking Africa's single market. As you've heard, we are at a pivotal moment for African economic integration. As the UN forecasts 4% growth for Africa in 2026, the African Continental Free Trade Area is unifying 1 billion consumers. And just recently, the AGOA legislation has been extended for another year. The business and investment case for Africa has never been stronger. But potential alone doesn't create prosperity. The real question is, how do we translate integration both internally through AfCFTA and globally through partnerships like AGOA into tangible growth, jobs, and competitiveness? So today we have 5 exceptional leaders joining us who are working on the front lines of this transformation. And together we will explore what's working, what's not, and most importantly, what needs to happen next. So to begin our panel discussion, I think I will just throw a question out to all of our panelists. As Ambassador Yad gave them a brief introduction, I will just remind we have Tobias Alando, who leads Kenya's manufacturers as they navigate regional integration. Mr. Fareed Belhaj, who brings decades of shaping the World Bank strategy across emerging markets and now advises on North African development. Dr. Oliver Kamanzi, who built Rwanda's capital markets from the ground up and now connects African businesses globally through the Africa Global Chamber of Commerce. Franny Lautier, who leads investment decisions at Southbridge after serving at the highest levels of the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And recently, she has been advising the president of the African Development Bank on his 100-day plan, where regional integration features very strongly. And of course, last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Daouda Simbine, who represented 23 African countries at the IMF and now advises governments on economic transformation through AfriCatalyst. Welcome again. So a question to all of the panelists, and perhaps we'll start with Mr. Alando. We often hear that the AfCFTA represents Africa's greatest opportunity for economic transformation. Certainly, we heard that just now from Secretary General Mene. But we're now several years into the implementation. From your vantage point, whether in manufacturing, finance, policy, or investment, what is the one tangible change that you've seen that gives the most confidence that the AfCFTA is moving from promise to reality? Mr. Alando, I'll start with you.
So thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'll start by saying that we are coming from a point of trade. And the point of trade is that the African continent has been trading within the trading blocks. AfCFTA is just supporting what we have been doing. So EAC has been trading on itself, SADC has been trading on itself, and COMESA. So AfCFTA has come on board to break sort of that barrier of trade that limited us from trading just within certain blocks and opened up our markets to the other African partners within the continent. With the ratification and liberalization of Category A of products, I think and with a focus of going to zero tariff by 2030, I think it has been a great opportunity for us as an African continent to look at how we can be able to export our goods more to the other African countries rather than the blocks that we have been doing. But the success has been in terms of Kenya. We've been able to export goods. The first consignment of goods in 2022 went to Ghana. We've seen consignments of goods going to Zambia. So it has been a great opportunity, and we are looking forward for ratification and liberalization of the next category, which is category B and C. But so far, we have seen traction and movement, and everyone is looking forward to tap into this new market. Remember, the world market, the Chinese market, the American market, have grown because of export. So the African market indeed is going to grow if we continue export. We'll be more experienced in terms of export so that we can only tap into African market alone, but the international market.
Excellent. Thank you. Now I'll turn over to Mr. Belhaj to answer the same question. What is the one tangible change you see that from the AfCFTA that gives you the most confidence that we're moving further towards reality?
Yeah, no, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Really great to be with so many great colleagues. I take the financial and banking sector. That's where integration becomes real. So if you're looking for real movement, I wouldn't say it is yet in trade volumes. We just heard SG Mene mention that. I believe it is in infrastructure. So take the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, for instance. It is live today. More than 15 countries are part of it. Afrexim Bank has grown from about $5 to $30 billion. This is in less than a decade. This is not symbolic. This is really scale. Pan-African banks like Eco Bank, UBA are positioned across dozens of countries. Moroccan and Egyptian banks are moving south. So there's a quiet financial corridor forming. So something is happening, yeah? But let's stay sober. I liked very much the way SG Mene kind of framed his own this whole interaction with Ambassador Ayad. Intra-African trade is still around 15 to 18%. On the north side of the continent, Maghreb integration is among the weakest in the world. North Africa is still more plugged, into Europe than into sub-Saharan Africa, which is a shame because there is so much potential in going south, actually. Capital markets are shallow almost everywhere in Africa, except South Africa and Morocco. Foreign exchange shortages are real in places like Egypt and Tunisia. And banks still prefer buying government debt over lending to cross-border industries. So yes, the plumbing is improving, but capital allocation hasn't fundamentally shifted towards continental value chains yet. So that's the real test of credibility.
Thank you. I think that's an important point, and I think that's actually a commission to the banks to sort of step it up to help support even further integration, and again the potential that exists with the AfCFTA and with Africa trade, inter-African trade, and investment in order to attract more from outside the continent as well. Just a reminder, and I should have mentioned this at the top to our virtual audience, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We don't need to wait until the end. If there are pertinent, pressing questions, we'll interject them into the conversation. Now I'd like to sort of ask Dr. Kimanzi as well for his thoughts on, where is the one promising area that you've seen with the AfCFTA, or perhaps even, where we might need to temper expectations and increase some engagement to make this promise a reality. Oh, I think you're still muted, Dr. Kamanzi. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. Before I respond to your question, allow me to thank Ambassador Ramayade for inviting me and also the whole team of Atlantic Council Africa Center. Thank you so much for inviting us, and also my co-panelists. Thank you, everyone, and everyone. Also, before that, I want to give you the mission of our chamber, Africa Global Chamber of Commerce. Our mission is in two key things. One is an advocacy organization on behalf of private sector, connecting global private sector to African private sector, also engaging African government with the US market. And the second is promoting trade, investments, cultural exchanges, education between Africa and the global markets, including the US. So that's really the work we do here at the Chamber. To your question, I think the most consequential positive change is the change of African narrative when it comes to value chain, adding value to these the supply chains. So what we see is conversation about how do we, Africa can stop exporting the raw materials, now adding value to the product. So AfCFTA has really allowed this conversation. So now I can tell you we have been involved in the Zero-Pito corridor, connecting Zambia to DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, to Angola. So we have been involved telling those countries, say, hey, before you move those minerals, critical minerals to the US, make sure that there is at least 20% of those minerals are transformed on whether it's copper, is it cobalt, is transformed in Zambia, in DRC. We now engaging those countries to say there has to be added value, and then something they are doing already. So I think that this story can transform the change in entire continent in terms of infrastructure, in terms of goods and services, making sure everything is done on the continent, produced in the continent, the added value in the continent, not just those minerals, agricultural products, and the many more products. I think that's why I see more changes. We will continue to keep involved. I can tell you, like next week, I'm hosting the cobalt metals, also the Zambia government, they'll be here in Chicago to discuss about this Zero-Pito corridor, how we can really engage US companies. When they go to Africa, they make sure they add value in everything they do. I think that narrative is really being embraced. We hope our countries can really adopt the policies in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamanzi. Yes, I know that this, the narrative around Africa and being a viable investment destination, and also the growing voices around making sure that the value add production is taking place on the continent instead of just solely being extracted is a critical element of that. And so as I turn to Franny Latier, I'd love to hear, I know you recently authored a paper on AGOA, and when we talk about sort of, engagement, what the new sort of paradigm of engagement, economic engagement from the United States with the continent, what that looks like, and with the recent one-year renewal of AGOA, but also, with the AfCFTA, how does that look? What does that interconnection looks like in terms of, growing more into reality this AfCFTA integration?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here with you moderating, given the role you have played to make some of these things happen that we are now seeing happening. And thank you again also to Ambassador Yad for inviting us and the Atlantic Council, and great to be with this excellent panel. I wanted to maybe use three things that build on the work that we did for that AGOA paper, and I'm very happy that it got extended. It is, if you combine what has just happened in Addis Ababa with the mandate now and the opening up of what we could do on the trade side because of what was just approved in Addis at the summit, and you look also at what just happened with the extension of AGOA, these are two twin elements that I think can help Africa propel forward in this short period of time and to really use it appropriately. We have a 1-year window to try to leverage that. So there are 3 areas that I see. The first one is to use the size of the US market to actually improve the standards by which Africa exports its products. So to raise the quality of production so that the companies that are manufacturing and creating value in Africa can actually participate at this higher end quality market through exports. You take some areas where we are already doing very well, the music industry. Right now, if you are a top-notch producer of music, there's no way you can have a record label without having an African artist. Same thing on the fashion industry. I know the Atlantic Council has done several events in that area. So the creative area has gone really well. The areas where we're still lagging are when it has to do with making things like manufacturing. And I think this is where the AGOA agreement can really help the companies to improve the standards. The second area, which I also think is critical, is linking up the capital markets in the United States to the markets in Africa, to crowd in capital that would then support the investments that the private sector needs to make. Farid already mentioned that this is one of the areas where we've seen a lot of progress on the banking side. Unfortunately, the financial private debt, private equity hasn't moved at the same pace. And that would be a good opportunity to link up also to the domestic capital that Africa has in its pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, and use this sort of improvement in standards to really push and finance the private sector. And here's a role that the development finance institutions can play. For example, the African Development Bank to offer de-risking capital, to invest in those strategic regional corridors, because right now there are very few who are entering into that space. They can issue guarantees that go across multiple countries. They can issue foreign exchange hedging solutions, including partnering with the IFC and others to do that in a strategic way. The third area, I think, is more around the unfinished business on the backbone side, the infrastructure, the backbone IT and telecommunications areas, because the Secretary General mentioned data. Data is actually riding on those investments, and there are some countries that still have very poor interconnectivity on the data side. AI is one of the big drivers, so that needs to be continued. And then fourth, looking at the remaining agenda on the ability of companies to freely move and invest and move products and services from one country to the other. So that is the logistic side, supply chain financing, cross-border working capital financing, and those areas that really remain quite difficult still. And then the last one, here I'm very proud to say we've done a lot on the cultural side, where people now speak first as continental Africans before they even reference their own countries. But I think we could do a lot more to make it easier for people to travel, to connect each other as a people-to-people connection. I'll stop here for now because of interest of time, but I think I'm very excited, and I see these twin opportunities as a great window for Africa right now.
Absolutely. Thank you for enumerating sort of the areas where AGOA can interplay well with the AfCFTA to help it achieve this full potential. And I think it fits very nicely going over, last but not least, to Mr. Sembene to talk about, Franny, you mentioned capital markets and what more they can do. And I know that that fits very well in the space where Mr. Sembene is working with AfCFTA's, excuse me, and what you've done in the past as well, the IMF. So please, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how, what do you see as the movement and the excitement towards full integration, and how markets can engage, capital markets can engage on the continent to help make the AfCFTA a full reality?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dana. Allow me to join my co-panelists in thanking the Atlantic Council Africa Center, led by Rama, our friends Rama, for inviting us to this important and timely discussion. I think, maybe I'll, before I respond to your question, I think the one thing that we definitely need to recognize and very much celebrate is the fact that we have concrete sort of development that shows that AfCFTA is moving from promise to reality. I think when we heard from the Secretary General earlier that now we have 50 countries that have ratified the agreement, this is something that needs to be celebrated. And now I think the most important part is, to recognize that this has been done within 10 years. And when the negotiation started, it was in 2017, and down the road, less than 10 years ago, 10 years after, we do have this very sort of significant achievement and milestone. I think this has to be celebrated. But we have to recognize, and just to come to your question, that we still are a long way toward full implementation of the CFTA. And without full implementation of the agreement, we cannot fulfill the potential of the agreement in terms of job creation, in terms of income generation, in terms of increase in productive capacity. So what should be done, and what is, of course, sort of impeding implementation of the CFTA? I think this is something that definitely needs to be addressed. Let me say that what we can see, and to add to what my co-panelists have said, and of course the Secretary General also, is that what we are seeing now on the ground is that there is still a big issue with non-tariff barriers. How to remove those barriers so that goods and services actually can flow from one region from Africa to others, and how to make sure that those are very much removed in a timely manner. I think that's where the challenges are still being noticed. You talked about it. I think there is certainly a need for harmonizing policies and, of course, harmonizing regulatory frameworks. And I think that would, of course, also apply to the financial sector and the capital markets, as you indicated. But we also have to recognize that policy harmonization alone will not be enough. And actually, it's not even possible. When we are talking about harmonizing policies and regulation, we are talking about a bulk and a big number of policies and regulation. And it's not certainly realistic to think that Africa will be able to harmonize all of them. But maybe what is very much important is to identify those that definitely needs to be harmonized because of their sort of transformative impact and their criticality. And so, some of those sometimes actually sort of relate to health and safety consideration. But then I think one thing that I've seen that the Secretariat is doing that is very much welcome is to also go towards the adoption of mutual recognition principles. I think this is the idea, and of course this is what Europe did, is the idea that you have to very much avoid that a product that is sold in one place is actually prohibited in another countries in Africa. So I think this idea of really adopting those mutual recognition principle is very much welcome, and I'm very glad to see that this is something that the Secretary of the AfCFTA has been working on recently, including through their technical meetings in some countries. So maybe one last thing that I would say, and of course I'll stop there, is I think we have also to remember that when we talked about the AfCFTA, of course, we should celebrate the legal achievement, but we also have to recognize that it's not only this that would be allowed, it's not only by focusing on the legal and political issues that we'll be able to move forward and accelerate implementation. I would certainly join my colleagues that in saying that there are a number of other issues that are still challenging that needs to be addressed. Of course, whether it's the infrastructure issues, whether it's the transportation issues, whether we are talking also about the industrial issues, because that's also something that is delaying negotiation. And that requires not only trade ministers and trade ministries to be around the table, but also other ministries, whether it's the finance ministries, whether it's the infrastructure ministries, the transportation ministries, industry ministries, to get around and make sure that they play their part. I think if you don't do that, it's going to be very difficult to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Mr. Mene. I'm going to take one question from the audience right now, from our virtual audience, because I think it's an important one. And please, whoever feels moved to so answer, but I think this might be a good question for Dr. Kamanzi. What can the African diaspora do to contribute to the successful implementation of the AfCFTA? And that's from Barbara Simmons, who is the co-chair of the National Bar Association's AfCFTA initiative.
Thank you so much, Dana. This is a very, very important question, especially to me as an African diaspora living here in the US, because I'm a role model of what diaspora can do. In 2008, the Rwanda was challenged with access to capital. No money, nothing. They have infrastructure project, all kinds of challenges they had. That's the country called me, because of my 30 years in investment banking, to go back to Rwanda to help to raise the money needed to develop Rwanda. In the 2007-2008, Rwanda, where it is today, wasn't there then. So what we did, have to develop financial markets for Rwanda as a diaspora. I went back, I spent 3 years. Those 3 years with my colleagues, we helped to really to build the financial market, set up the Rwanda Stock Exchange, the capital market. We've been able to mobilize the capital to build what you call Kigali Convention Center. Rwanda Air, that's at the time we had only one airline. Now we have more than 13 airlines flying all over Africa, flying out of Africa. We have been able to build one of the largest convention center with the capacity of 5,000 people, with a tune of 300 million. So just to tell you what diaspora can do, for me, I contributed. What is needed, the building capacity, human capacity, is one of the challenges for the African market to move on. To do it, the African need its diaspora. When we talk about diaspora, it's not just African immigrant. We're talking about African American. We're talking Afro-Caribbean. We're talking Afro-Latino. All these people want to come back, build Africa we want. So I think when we look at a country like Ghana, you have more doctors, medical doctors in New York, more than the Ghana itself as a country. You have more engineers in Houston, in Texas, of Nigerians, more than Nigeria. If those two countries can decide to repatriate, so we have experienced what we call brain drain for human capacity for Africans going away because of many reasons. So we have now to call them back to build our country, Africa we want. So we have, right now, we have more mining engineers in Australia, in Canada. So we have a group of 1,000 mining engineers outside of Africa. We are talking about energy transition of critical minerals. If we want now to build this supply chain, we need to repatriate our diaspora everywhere they are. They are not only in the US, or we have a big diaspora in Brazil of over 100 million. So we have a diaspora all over the world. Africa can really count on its diaspora. If Africa has to move, has to really count on diaspora. That's how I can say, but I can say more and more. Because I have been involved doing some studies, finding what diaspora are. We have a group of diaspora in IT technology. We have a group of diaspora in energy engineers. So we have data which we can share with the African government to provide those data. They can enjoy those numbers. We have done that at the chamber. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumanzi. When we talk about building the Africa we want, which of course is the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and which lays out sort of the structure and the guidelines, the aspirations. And I think back to a point that Dauda made about being really like we need to acknowledge that a lot of what has taken place over the past 10 years with the AfCFTA is really extraordinary and monumental. And the work is not yet done, but there is more to do. And when you talk about looking people on the ground and what they're seeing, I'd like to turn to Mr. Orlando from your perspective, from the manufacturers that you talk to, that your organization handles in Kenya. What are some of the things that they are saying about the AfCFTA and how what is the most frustrating sort of barrier that the AfCFTA perhaps was supposed to eliminate but still exists? And when you talk to perhaps other manufacturers in other African countries, are they experiencing the same? And so how can your organization and others sort of, move towards a greater reality and the AfCFTA meeting those challenges?
So thank you very much. I think in terms of the challenges that AfCFTA are facing is non-tariff barriers and mostly technical barriers to trade. The question is, what are we doing as a private sector to address some of those challenges? So as a policy organization, definitely we do have identified and raised those issues to our government agencies with recommendations on action they need to take. But from the private sector angle within Africa, we also interact with the other private sector organizations within Africa to influence policy decisions to kind of change the non-tariff and technical barriers to trade that we have. Currently, we have a lot of complex and inconsistent customs procedures. So you move from one country to another, it's flowing, but you move to the next country, it's still a big challenge. We have issues around divergence, regulatory standards, and certification requirements, where we don't have a standardized, agreed certification that will allow goods to move from one country into another smoothly. So that's something that we really need to address. The other issues around logistics. Africa is vast. Africa is big. Moving from one country into another with the infrastructure, with a poor infrastructure between different borders becomes a major challenge. We need to really work on addressing the infrastructure issue. Technology is also one of the key things that needs to be addressed in terms of seeing that goods are moving from one country into another with technology, poor technology transfer. Internet is not stable in almost all the country. So there are issues that we need to address. The other major issue is about peace in the continent, because if you need to airlift your product from one country into another, there are restrictions. There are air restriction, either because of war in certain areas, and that air restriction raises a lot of costs in terms of routing your cargo to other routes, which may take quite a long time. Mm-hmm. The air traffic fees, apart from when now there is no conflict, but the air traffic fees is also very, very expensive within the African continent. And it's a conversation that we've also raised in the last meetings we had under the AU to see if the African governments could renegotiate and work on a subsidized air traffic fees, because that will definitely have an impact on how we move. I'll give an example of one manufacturers who was moving or who was exporting his goods to the French West Africa, and the goods have to go to France, then come back to Africa. And that is still very costly. So these are the challenges that we are facing. And just also to add up to the question that the diaspora person had asked on the comment, that what do they need to do? One is invest in infrastructure, try and support investment in infrastructure and technology in Africa, because Africa is a big market. We just need to do what we need to do to utilize the market that we have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Orlando. And I definitely agree with that in terms of the diaspora engagement as well. Over to Fareed, when we talk about sort of some of the challenges that Tobias laid out, what can African policymakers do to alleviate some of these so that the implementation of the AfCFTA can be more fully realized? I know you've worked in, other regions where there are these types of agreements, and how policymakers and the regulatory environment can marry up to support one another. So what are some perhaps recommendations for African policymakers as they move forward with AfCFTA integration?
Yeah, no, thank you, Dana. I must say that all this conversation is great because it is candid. And let me answer candidly. Maybe through a good, bad, and ugly type of approach. The good, I must say, is that Africa, through the free trade agreement, has done something historically ambitious. There's no doubt about it. The SG mentioned it, and each one of the colleagues mentioned it. It has moved beyond rhetoric into actual architecture, which is great. A continent of 54 states has agreed on a rules-based framework for trade liberalization. We need to salute that. There's no doubt about it. This is compared to the fragmentation that we have seen in other parts of the world. So in a way, Africa is ahead in terms of institutional imagination, but the bad is the implementation part of it. Integration, frankly, is not something that you declare. It is something that you do engineer. Tariff schedules, customs interoperability, very important. Logistics corridors, we've spoke about it. Dispute settlement credibility, and predictability. This is absolutely fundamental. These are very, I would say, unglamorous details, but they are the ones that determine success at the end of the day. In other regions, failure comes often not from a lack of vision, but from a lack of disciplined execution, and possibly of political patience, because that too is important. We need to take into account some of the dynamics, internal dynamics of countries, but also, whether we like it or not, the sub-regional and regional dimensions. We see that in North Africa with the whole issues between Algeria and Morocco, that are really impeding the Maghreb to see the light of day. Now let me go to the ugly part of the conversation, and this really where the hard truth is. It is that integration without productive capacity becomes really symbolic. We talk and talk and talk. At the end of the day, what are we trading? You cannot trade what you are not producing, and what you're not producing competitively. We have infrastructure gaps. It's a reality. We have energy deficits. And God knows that the potential is absolutely amazing in Africa, but still the deficits are there. We have weak industrial bases, the regulatory fragmentation. I remember years back when I was still at the World Bank, there was this whole conversation about harmonizing legal frameworks for investment in large parts of Africa. Where is that? Have we made some headways? So if there is one lesson Africa should urgently apply and that we see it in other regions. You mentioned that I worked in East Asia, and really you see the good there, what it means to have an integration that is backed by reality, is that integration must be anchored in power realities and economic substance, not just in legal aspirations. Institutions matter, yes, absolutely, but competitiveness, infrastructure, and political ownership matter even more. I'm sorry to be direct, but I mean, this is the reality that we are facing.
I think we all appreciate the directness and the good, bad, and the ugly. And just to pick up on that note, Dauda, I'd like to turn to you. And just noting, we started a little bit late, so we have about 5 minutes remaining. So I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to be brief in your assessment. But what is your honest, frank assessment of the policy harmonization and the implementation that businesses really need? What's your advice? What is your good and bad, ugly, perhaps on accelerating this?
Well, thank you, Dana. I think this is something that definitely I'm happy to repeat. I think the reality is implementation is lagging. I think if the Secretary General, in his opening remark, he very much told us about what the head of states agree on during the AU summit, which is the needs to accelerate implementation. So there is definitely some work that needs to be done in concluding some of the protocols that are still being negotiated, and making sure at the end of the day, after making sure that we do have agreed protocol, to put them into practice, how to make sure that those legal provision are implemented in practice. I think that's where definitely the work remains to be done. I think I mentioned earlier, and also other co-panelists also mentioned the fact that the issue remains with the non-tariff barriers, but also other practical challenges that relates to infrastructure, but also logistics and other things. What I would add to this is very much important is that, yes, I think if you want to move forward, you need to harmonize your rules. You need to make sure that there is some integration of regulatory framework across the continent. But like I said earlier, I think what is also important is to know that this is not going to be a panacea. Even if you have harmonized the rule, which is extremely complicated when we are talking about a big number of rules and policies. Even when you do so, the challenge will be in implementation, and that's where we do have some issues. When you agree on, let's say, some sort of procedures, and then you come down on the ground, and the customs administration is not able, due to weak capacity, to put them into practice, there is an issue. So that's also an issue that we need to keep in mind, how to very much improve capacities across the custom systems, but across also all actors that are involved in making the AfCFTA a reality. I think that's critical to move forward. But let me add something, and I finish there, Dana. At the end of the day, even if we have the AfCFTA that is ratified, the objective is for trade to take place under AfCFTA preferences. This is happening to a less extent right now, although we have to very much welcome the trend that we have seen. Back into 2022, the AfCFTA Secretariat launched what they call the Guided Trade Initiative, which is aimed at actually initiating commercially significant trades under AfCFTA preferences. At that time, there was only maybe 8 countries that was taking trading under AfCFTA preferences. Now we understand that there are over 30 countries across Africa that are doing so. This is a good positive trend that needs to be accelerated, so that what we agree in practice at the legal level translate into practice on the ground. I think this is critical. Last but not least, and I think this is very much important in the context of the geopolitical environment that we are facing now. I think it would be counterproductive for African countries to agree on the AfCFTA, but at the same time, negotiate bilateral agreement that actually contradict what they committed to under the AfCFTA, or that actually provide undue privileges to their bilateral partners. So we need to very much make sure that doesn't happen, and that we keep in sort of the close ranks and making sure that we speak, with one voice on trade. I think that would be the best way to very much leverage strategically this very promising sort of achievement that Africa is still building. And I think there is a lot of sort of positive sort of sentiment that is going on the right way, although we need to do more and accelerate the trends.
Excellent point, Dada. I agree. I think it's important as we move forward, particularly in this space, that countries are not doing and negotiating agreements that somehow contradict what they're meant to do under their AfCFTA ratification. Franny, very, very briefly, because we're running out of time. In fact, we're almost out of time. Would you mind, please, just sort of given your expertise as well with AGOA and the AfCFTA, and you've laid it out quite nicely for us earlier, but can you sort of talk about how African countries and businesses should be thinking about the U.S. market right now, again, with AGOA only being ratified for 1 year, but in terms of planning, in terms of investment, in terms of engagement, in terms of not negotiating things that will be contrary to their AfCFTA requirements, how should African countries be thinking about the U.S. nexus and engagement right now?
Yeah, so I think if we look at it this way, the AfCFTA has opened the door. AGOA has come in to do the renovations. Now the African companies have to decide who comes to live in that house and what to do when they're there. So 3 things I would say. First, to do the easy things. There are a lot of things that companies can do today with the existing standards, existing limitations in energy, infra, travel, etc., but they can jump in and do those things. And we've seen it on the digital space, for example. There are students right now who graduate University of Dodoma, and they're working with US companies offering services in cyber. So nothing has changed. They're the same infrastructure. So I think those easy, low-hanging fruits, companies should jump in and take the opportunity. The second is now on the strategic corridors. We talked about Lobito. There are quite a few others. I think to build those up and get the full solution, all the supporting infrastructure, so that we can have a demonstration effect. By the end of 1 year of extension, there should be no doubt on the US side why this was a good idea. And I think this is really key. But then the third one is to do these really hard things that need to be done, that on the legal side, on the regulatory side, on the movement of people, on all the standards and certification and so on that are holding back companies. And there I'll close with the role of development finance institutions to move from funding just the foundational things like infrastructure and the backbone, IT and so on, to now go and supporting companies and people to actually take advantage of these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And what a beautiful way to really wrap it up. And you painted a quite, I think, a very useful visual for the AfCFTA and integration and companies and policymakers and countries to define really what does the AfCFTA and its implementation do for creating the Africa that they want to see and for the prosperity and the economic development of its people, and to really grow and to make it move beyond a declaration, but to engineering the future that we want to see under the AfCFTA on the continent. We are so out of time, but I'd like to thank all of the esteemed panelists for your rich contribution and for joining us virtually. Until soon.